I've had my share of traumatic experiences, some supernatural in nature, and others just the result of everyday life. And it's easy to forget that other people have their own horrors, their own trauma. And when we see people smiling, we usually don't think about the hard parts of their lives. My father, however, has countless stories of his own that range from the tragic to the bizarre. He has a vault of terrible things that he keeps locked away in his memories. But every now and then, he lets a story slip out. These are some of those stories my dad told me from his life. So find somewhere safe, dim the lights, and while you listen to them, ask yourself what kind of stories your own parents might have. I suppose at one point, my stepmother was a good person. She must have loved and been loved because years and years ago, my dad married her. The hard part of knowing that she was once someone capable of love is knowing that the woman I met, the woman I knew, was purely a bad, cruel person that seemed to only find joy in being hurtful to me and my siblings. Now, for whatever reason, my dad either chose not to believe us when we would tell her how hurtful and mean she was, or maybe deep down he just didn't care enough to stop her. That's what I used to think, at least. But after seeing how he handled her death, I wonder if he too was afraid of her. She died abruptly around 1985. Nothing suspicious, just a fast-moving sickness that seemed to suck the life right out of her. And honestly, it didn't bother me in the slightest to watch it happen to her. She would just sit in her rocking chair and mumble to herself before randomly screaming at me or my sisters to clean, go outside, or just get away from her. Needless to say, none of us cried when one day she just never got out of that chair again. Her will told us that she wanted to be cremated and for her ashes to be laid to rest in the woods behind the house. We all sat at the little table in the kitchen, waiting in silence for the man from the mortuary to drop off her ashes. Finally, we heard a loud knock on the door that startled all of us. It was an unexpected sound, but I guess because of our shared silence, it broke us out of whatever bad memory of her we were thinking about. My dad just nodded to me. I was eager to get this over with, so after a nod from my dad, I quickly went to the door. I vaguely recall shaking the man's hand after he handed me the urn, but I clearly remember him smiling oddly as he looked over my shoulder and into the house, where my father and two sisters still sat at the table. Nobody was crying. I imagine the man was used to a bit more ceremony, but he didn't know that we simply wanted this over with. As I turned back to the kitchen, I saw my father put his old baseball cap on. He stood up and took a deep breath before coming to join me at the front door. On his way through the living room, he had stopped and his eyes locked under my stepmother's chair as it began to rock slowly on its own. "We need to go now," he said loudly, and he tore his gaze away from the chair and walked right past me out of the house. My siblings ran through the living room to follow him, and when they were all out, I looked back at the chair to see that it was now rocking so fiercely that I was afraid it was going to launch itself at me. I ran away just like they did. None of us acknowledged what we saw. None of us wanted to talk about it and put it into words because it was terrifying. But it wasn't the worst thing we had seen before. You see, my stepmother was different. Beyond being just a mean, evil person, she was connected to the world in ways that we didn't understand. She could see things before they happened. She would get onto us for whatever we did wrong in school before she had any way of knowing it. One time I was held back from recess for talking too much in class. And when I got home, she was waiting in her chair with a leather belt. No, not to use on me like that. No, she put the belt around my face so that it covered my mouth and pulled it tight. Tight enough to leave marks. She was that kind of horrible. Here now, with her ashes in my hands, I felt nothing but hatred for her. My father led us through the backyard into the tree line of the woods. He had picked up a machete from the back of his truck on the way, and was now casually chopping away at vines and branches that seemed to have grown overnight and blocked the path. He led us about 50 yards into the woods. Then, without a word, he knelt down and used his hands to dig out a little spot. He took the urn from me, tossed the lid aside, and dumped her ashes into the hole he had just dug. Then he covered the hole and tossed the urn aside, all without saying anything. Then he stood up, dusted off his hands on his jeans, and took a breath before finally saying some words about her. He told us all how he had loved her, and she had loved us before her mental illness had taken away her kindness and replaced it with something dark. But I didn't believe a word he said because I had no memory of her ever being kind to any of us. Right there in the woods, he asked us and God to forgive her for her cruelness, although I'm not sure God had anything to do with her. He paused for a moment. Maybe he was waiting for one of us to say that we forgave her, but to this day, none of us have ever uttered those words. When it was clear nothing else was going to be said, my dad lifted the machete and stabbed it into the very spot he had just put her ashes. He shoved it so far down that all we could see was the black handle of the machete. When I asked him why he did that, he said, "She can never harm any of us as long as this machete keeps her down. This is going to protect us from her." He had spoken in a very serious tone. Now, this was a highly unusual thing to hear anyone say, but especially him since he was never a superstitious man. But the thing I noticed most was how he had said, "She can never harm any of us." And for the first time, I wondered what terrible thing she had done to him. I wondered what kind of hold she had had over him to make him stay with her despite her evil intentions. None of us went back into that house. We got into his truck and he took us to his sister's house. And from that moment on, life was better for us. I know the house sold eventually, and I often wondered if that machete is still holding her down all these years later, keeping us safe from her, even in death. I volunteered at a hospital when I was 12 years old. Being so young limited what I was able to do, which was fine since my favorite thing was to read the newspaper to the paralyzed man on the 3rd floor. Each day I would walk in with a daily newspaper, and before I could read the news to him, he would tell me some new horrible thing he had done during the war, as if our time together was a time for his confessions. It was always the same kind of things, and he was convinced that being paralyzed was his punishment for the enemies he had killed, and that he was doomed to go to hell for eternity. After telling me this for the, 100th time, he would ask for a drink of water and ask me what was new in the world outside of the VA hospital. He had not moved his arms or legs in almost a year, and I always felt his sadness as he looked out the window and listened to me reading about what people were doing out there where he could no longer be. One day, after telling me again that he was going to hell when he died, he asked me not to read the paper, but instead just to talk to him about the things outside, the things that I could see and hear. I guess he was tired of hearing the bad things that the news tells us. I told him how good the grass felt, and how cool the breeze had been with the changing season. I told him I'd hit a home run over the weekend and how my team cheered and jumped up and down while I rounded the bases. For the first time in a long time, he smiled. I offered him water that he drank through a straw, and by then, the sadness was already back. It was in his eyes. When that visit was over, I said goodbye and I left the room, hoping that I had at least made a moment of his day better with my story. But halfway down the hall, lights blinked on, and an alarm rang, which meant that someone was in distress. I turned, somehow knowing that it was him, and when I saw the nurses rushing into his room, I ran back to him. The time we had spent together was sometimes awkward, but I felt like this old man was my friend, and he needed at least one friend. But it was hard for me because I could hear him screaming over the alarms. He kept yelling, "I'm on fire. Oh my God, I'm burning." When I reached the door, I felt terrified and stunned. He was standing on his bed and waving his arms around. He swatted at his arms and legs in an attempt to put out the fires that only he could see. And in a twisted way, he looked sort of like a dancing puppet on strings. Someone pulled me away and a cart was pushed inside the room while the man continued to scream in agony and dance around in a panic. The crowd gasped and I looked back into the room to see him collapse on top of the bed with his arms and legs hanging loosely off, just like someone had cut the strings that had been holding him up. His mouth was closed, but his eyes were still wide open. And everything was strangely silent as I watched the nurses straighten him out and get him onto the cart. Then I heard the long whine of the machine showing a steady flat line where his heartbeat had been. I was ushered out of the room and the door shut abruptly in my face. Tears welled up in my eyes as I stood there frozen by what had just happened. I couldn't understand how this paralyzed man could have been standing on his bed and dancing around in such a terrified frenzy. My 12-year-old brain couldn't process seeing and hearing my friend in such distress. A warm hand on my shoulder made me jump, and I turned around to see the hospital's priest looking into my eyes. And I'd met the chaplain before, but I'd never seen him with such a serious look on his face. "Are you all right?" he asked me, with his eyes looking all around my face like he was trying to read my thoughts. "I think so," was all I could say, even though I'm not sure I was okay. "Bess, this was not meant for you to see," he said quietly. "That man was very sick." "No, I know," I said back, thinking that he meant the paralysis and the trauma of war. But then the priest asked me very calmly, "Do you believe in hell?" I stared at him. Truthfully, I hadn't given it much thought before today, but after seeing what had just happened, maybe I did believe. But without waiting for me to respond, he added, "You know, we all go where we think we deserve to be." And that man was very sick. Sparks rose from the bonfire as one of the children asked me to tell them a ghost story. We lived out in the sticks, several miles from town, and every now and then we would have bonfires with some of the neighbors. The adults and children knew me as a good storyteller since I loved to talk, and people seemed to enjoy listening. So at the request of this child, I quickly came up with a simple ghost story off the top of my head, about the hand-dug well on the neighbor's land. I told them how when the well was being dug, it had collapsed on a man. And on moonless nights like this one, you could hear him crying out for help as he lay trapped at the bottom of the well. But to my surprise, a young girl that lived nearby asked me who told me that story, because she had heard it too. One of the children at the fire was the neighbor's boy, and he even said that he had heard the man's cries from the well many times before. I had to keep myself from laughing at them because I had just made up the story right in front of them. Yet here these kids were with proof that it was real, when it wasn't. The next day I was surprised to see the neighbor at my door, and I thought I was going to get an earful about making the kid afraid. But instead, she told me the story she had heard of the well on their land. She said that the locals used to come and get water, but over time they had stopped because they couldn't bear to hear the cries coming from the well. They had all decided to go to other wells for their water, wells that were not haunted. I just listened in shock, as it had seemed that the well really had a story of its own, and my made-up story was somehow correct. The neighbor's son and mine were pretty good friends, and he would stay with us often. One night while staying with us, he told me that his family had been hearing voices all around the house. They would hear soft cries from outside, and even noises coming from the well that was sealed with boards for safety. His parents had started to fight with each other, and seemed to have an attitude quite often. He said he didn't feel comfortable at home anymore, which broke my heart to hear, so I always let him come over and stay with my son when he wanted to. 1 week later, I ran outside of my house to see the neighbor and his family outside watching while their house burned to the ground. And I think I was more panicked than they were, because they actually looked calm about it, relieved even. They sold the property, and over the years we fell out of touch. This was before social media, so it was a lot easier to lose track of neighbors back then. One day I came home from work to see a trailer was out there. The young couple came and introduced themselves, and I thought that was that. The old property was no longer abandoned, and something good would come out of that land. But no, they left a month later, leaving everything behind, even the trailer. I never found out why they abandoned their little home. Years later, an older couple moved into the property, and we've spoken several times. They seem like good people. They told me they had cameras set up all around the trailer, inside and out. They said they'd been trying to catch a ghost, but laughed when they said it so I wouldn't take it too serious and think that they were crazy or something. But they do seem like good people, so I've never told them my story, or the stories I'd heard. I just smile and wave at them when I see them, hoping that the story of the neighbor's property is finally over. And that's it for today's dive into the creepy tales my dad used to tell me. Whether he was just trying to scare me into behaving when I was a kid, or really believed some of these things, I'll let you decide. Now, if you've got a spooky story from your parents or childhood, drop it in the comments. I'd love to read them, preferably at night. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next chill or thrill. Until next time, sleep tight, stay safe out there.